even the apocryphal work of 4th Ezra, which is not accepted by the Roman Catholic Church as scripture, makes reference to the fact that there's 24 books. The Jewish canon was generally counted as either 22 or 24 books. We see that in the Church Fathers as well. When they're referring to the Jewish canon, they talk about the fact that it had 22, 24. Sometimes they number it as 27, depending on how they combine books. So, for example, you might combine Judges and Ruth together as one book. You would count the 12 minor prophets as a single book. But in any event, the combination of evidence from the Jews is one-sided. There's a heavy weight of evidence against the deuterocanonical books as being scripture. The biblical testimony is similarly one-sided. The New Testament does not quote the Septuagint as scripture. There are some allegations that it makes some references to the Apocrypha, and we may sit down and discuss whether or not there's any references, allusions, or anything like that. But the New Testament refers to portions of Scripture and calls them Scripture, but it never refers to the Apocrypha and calls them Scripture. One of the points that I frequently point out is the fact that when Jesus was speaking, he spoke about the blood of righteous Abel unto the blood of Zacharias, the son of Barachias, whom he slew between the temple and the altar. And when you consider that statement, the way that it makes sense is when Jesus is providing a sort of A to Z list of all the martyrs. It wouldn't really make sense for him to pick someone out of the middle of nowhere and not to include martyrs found in the books of the Maccabees if he accepted the books of Maccabees as scripture. But the people will speculate because he's obviously not trying to specifically define the canon. He's just using the canon. And Mr. Albrecht seems to think there's no evidence about what the last book of the Hebrew canon is. And I wonder if he has looked at a Hebrew listing of the canon before. I think you'll find that it does indeed end with 2 Chronicles. The fourth area that we'll discuss is the testimony of the early church. The testimony of the early church has been partly discussed by Mr. Albrecht already, and so I'll try to condense it a little bit. First of all, of course, the most prominent figure is Jerome, who rejected them. He is most prominent because of the important role that he played in assembling the Bible for the Western Church. He unwillingly translated these deuterocanonical works, which were later included, although against his will. He did not accept them as scripture, and he didn't accept them as scripture based on his study. We're told about scholarship and so forth. The scholarship of his day, closest to the time of the apostles, closest to when the Jews passed on the scriptures to us, his scholarship told him that those are not books that were accepted by the Jews. They are not Jewish books. And it's not simply a question of whether or not he could find a Hebrew original. He couldn't find one because the Jews didn't preserve them. But nevertheless, the matter of Jerome, we may go backwards from Jerome. We may look at some of the earlier members of the church. Athanasius specifically does not include wisdom. He specifically does not include Sirach. Let me be more specific. With Athanasius, he treats Baruch and the letter of Jeremiah as though they were part of Jeremiah, but he specifically omits wisdom, Sirach, Judith, Tobit, and he also omits Esther. And it goes to show that he's fallible, yes, but nevertheless, it goes to show that there's not some sort of consistent testimony of the early church for all those books being canonical. If Athanasius is unaware of this, and it's hard to imagine a more central figure in that period of church history than Athanasius, then how in the world could this be a legitimate apostolic tradition passed down? The same thing goes with Origen. He omits all of the Apocrypha except Jeremiah from except the letter of Jeremiah from his list. Melito of Sardis omits all of the Apocrypha and additionally omits Esther. The Council of Laodicea, which there's some question about whether or not its canon is original or was added some years later. It basically follows Athanasius. Cyril of Jerusalem follows Origen. Gregory of Nazianzus follows Athanasius. Amphilochius follows Athanasius. Epiphanius of Salamis follows an earlier anonymous list that we have, but we don't know who wrote it. And he ends up matching the Protestant quote-unquote canon exactly. And of course, we already talked about Jerome. That kind of brings us through the early church period. But let's take a quick look at the later church period. Even right before the Reformation, we have the testimony of two cardinals of the Roman Church, Cardinal Cajetan and Cardinal Jimenez. These two cardinals both treated the deuterocanonical books as having an inferior status, as not being of the rule of faith and life, not being part of that rule, but being books to be read, books for edification. This inferior status is not the position that Trent ended up taking. It did not assign to Maccabees, for example, the idea that it's not part of the rule, but only useful for edification. And Trent represents, therefore, the break with the historical pattern of not accepting these books. Now, not accepting them as scripture, as inspired, nevertheless accepting them as useful. So, Gary Machuda's book asks the question, why are Catholic Bibles bigger? We may indeed ask that. Why is that the case? Why are these Bibles, including these books that were not accepted by the early church, were not even accepted right up to the Reformation by cardinals of the Roman Church? These are books that the Jews never accepted, books that don't fit the biblical testimony, and books that themselves contain factual and doctrinal errors. So with that, I would now conclude my constructive speech and prepare for the cross-examination period.